morning. It is a funny question. We asked the question whether there was a German Revolution in 1918 and 19, or better yet, why that German Revolution, which it seemed really was about to take place in 1918, by 1923 was defeated and a failure. And we say that the question that we pose about the German Revolution is of overarching importance and poignant and why. And I ask you to exert your imagination. And it is out of the defeat of that German Revolution at the end of the First World War that the fate of the German working classes is sealed. And that from that time until this, those German working classes were to have to cope with the dominion of a very powerful industrial class. But I ask you to exert your imagination even further. That it is that failure of the German Revolution after the First World War which sealed the fate of the Soviet Revolution, because the Soviet Union depended upon that Western Revolution. And when the German Revolution failed, Europe would remain quiescent and stable, as they say. And that would mean that the Soviet Union, if it were to develop, had to develop socialism in one country, as they called it. In other words, that its economic development, its development as a socialist country, would have to be distorted by that kind of statism, that kind of terrorism that actually implied its accretion of capital out of its own resources. But I ask you to exert your imagination even one step further. That the failure of that German Revolution after the First World War is related in a very intimate way to the ultimate success of National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s. And when you talk about that defeat or failure, you are really talking about the fate of men and women throughout the Western world. And so we ask the question, was there a German Revolution really in November of 1918? On the face of it, of course. And it was a revolution that sprang from below. That first week of November was a week of turbulence in 1918. Beginning with the mutiny of the sailors at Kiel, all the way through that first week of November, there were popular riots in the major cities of Germany, culminating in those great strikes on the 9th of November in Berlin, which saw ultimately the collapse of the old political order. The 9th of November of 1918, the German Emperor William II abdicated, the ministry of Max of Baden fell, and suddenly there is a republic in Germany, a republic whose executive is called a Council of People's Commissars, 6 commissars, now presumably ruling Germany in the interests of the lower classes. That kind of a revolution seemed to happen in November of 1918. And yet, on closer examination, that revolution was not very profound. What it was ultimately was described by Rosa Luxemburg herself. Rosa Luxemburg, released from prison in the wave of those strikes in November of 1918, released from a jail in Breslau, and who was to go then in December of 1918 to the founding Congress of the German Communist Party between the 30th of December and the 1st of January of 1919. And at that particular Congress, Rosa Luxemburg made an analysis of what had happened in that first week of November and what remained to be done. And she said that there had been a political revolution, that there had obviously been a change of regime and a republic had been established. But there had as yet been no social revolution, that the old forces, the old institutions of Hohenzollern Germany remained in place, and that it was necessary to go further and to think about a social revolution. What she said was that what had happened in November of 1918 rested upon 2 illusions, and those illusions could not continue to stand. The first illusion was the illusion of a working class in Germany that believed that the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, had indeed led a revolution for it. And the second illusion, the illusion of that Social Democratic Party, that it could depend upon the army and contain and restrain any further social revolution. Both of them illusions, said Rosa Luxemburg, and she was wrong. Because in both instances, those illusions were not illusions, that the working class of Germany in November of 1918 really did, in its majority, opt for the Social Democratic Party, for those majority socialists who had supported the war, thinking that they were really socialists, and little did they withdraw their support over the years that were to follow. and that Social Democratic Party did strike its deal with the army and did contain that social revolution from below, which Rosa Luxemburg thought was inevitable, certainly which she thought was desirable in the evolution of Germany. What happened essentially in November of 1918 in Germany went something like this: that there was, after all, a social democratic party led by very moderate and even conservative kinds of socialists who were afraid of street action, who were afraid of any kind of revolution that really might overturn violently the institutions of Germany. Those socialists were led by Fritz Ebert, who was the Secretary General of the Social Democratic Party, and with the assistance of Philipp Scheidemann, who was, after all, considered the great theorist of this particular reformist party. And both of them, in that first week of November of 1918, expressed very clearly their hostility to a real revolution, even before the Emperor abdicated on the 9th of November. It is Ebert who says to the Chancellor Max of Baden, and it is in the memoirs of Max of Baden that we find this out, says to him, urge the Emperor to abdicate and you become the regent, because if we do not have a regency, we will have a republic that may go too far, we will have a revolution that I personally will hate. And it is on the 9th of November of 1918 when Liebknecht himself goes, after all, to the royal palace and from the balcony proclaims to the cheering workers the Socialist Republic. It is only at that point that Philipp Scheidemann goes to the Reichstag and says, we opt for a republic. You see what is at stake here, that the moderate Social Democrats, not having been able to head off a revolution, tried to contain it by putting themselves at the head of it. And consequently, they agreed to a council of people's commissars, 3 of those commissars to be Social Democrats, 3 of them to be USPD, in other words, independent socialists. And why did they make that generous arrangement, 3 and 3? They made it because they fully suspected, and they were right, that most independent socialists, even though they had broken with the SPD in the course of the war, and had formed their own party in 1917, that they really were pacifists and not revolutionaries. That there only was a little left wing of the independents who really were revolutionaries, and of course the Spartacist League, and neither of those would be represented in this Council of People's Commissars. They would go with that particular formulation. But it was even more than that, you see, that these Social Democrats really had a strategy of containment, a strategy of how to make a bourgeois republic with a certain reformist elan to contain the workers and to go no further. In other words, to do what they had wanted to do before 1914 and no different than that. And the strategy ran something like this, that they would depend upon certain forces which would enable them to contain any further evolution of that kind of street action or that kind of revolution. One of those forces was, yes, the army. And the relationship between the Social Democrats and the army becomes all important and all crucial because the SPD leaders can call out the army incessantly in December of 1918 and in January of 1919 in order to clear the streets, to keep the streets quiet. Now that deal between the army and the SPD is worked out very quickly. It is on the 10th of November of 1918 that the army chiefs, in complete disarray, if you please, meet in their headquarters in Kassel. And there are 39 high-ranking officers there, and they bat around 2 questions. The first question is, can they depend upon the army to save the Kaiser? In other words, to save the monarchy, and only one of the 39 officers answers yes. In other words, the Kaiser was lost. There was no point of trying to save the monarchy. The other question that they posed, was the army ready to combat Bolshevism, to combat it, after all, in Russia, and to combat it on the streets of Germany? And here the officers were very hesitant. 8 of them said absolutely no, the army would not fight against Bolshevism because it would radicalize. 19 of them were very hesitant and said they didn't know. 12 of them said they needed more time, these officers, in order to propagandize their troops as to the danger of Bolshevism. And the next product of that debate was to say that their best bet was to depend upon these moderate socialists, that only the moderate socialists, after all, would be able to talk to the working class of Germany and persuade them that they really did have a revolution. And that kind of a deal that the army wanted was acceptable to Ebert and the leaders of the majority socialists. Because Ebert himself tells us in 1924 this: I proposed to Hindenburg at that time that the High Command ally itself with the SPD, since there was no other party in Germany with enough influence on the masses to establish order if that party had the help of the army. And consequently, you get a direct telephone line from Ebert to General Headquarters in Kassel, and to General Bremer, who was at that time the Chief of Staff. And there are daily telephone conversations that go back and forth in which the SPD leaders call upon troops when it is necessary to keep order, and in which the officers keep encouraging these moderate socialists to retain order and not to be shy in the face of working class demands. And consequently, that kind of symbiosis really becomes one of the props in the strategy of moderate socialism in containing this revolution. And secondly, a deal with the industrialists. A deal with the industrialists which keeps the socio-economic order intact. And it is the Arbeitsgemeinschaft, the deal which is called the Community of Economic Interests, a kind of agreement which is signed on the 15th of November between the chiefs of the German trade unions, who are moderate and reformist and hardly revolutionary, along with the great industrialists of Germany, names that really send a bit of chill down one's spine. Schmidt, after all, and Hugenberg, and Rathenau, men who were at the very top of German industry in the iron and steel trade, in the electrical trade, in the chemical trade, and this agreement, the Arbeitsgemeinschaft, was signed on the 15th of November so that the industrialists could keep their factories and so that the workers would get some illusion at any rate of reform, because that agreement was the agreement for the 8-hour day, for the recognition of trade unions by these great industrialists, and for the setting up of arbitration commissions of employers and workers in the various factories. And you see what is at stake here. It means that in this revolution, there will be no socialization of the means of production. It means that iron and steel and the other great enterprises will not be socialized, all the time that the SPD is talking about socialism advancing and marching on, because the agreement was thoroughly a reformist agreement. But the third prop of this strategy is the most important prop. And it is the most surprising one if you think, after all, that the Allied countries fought 4 bitter years against what they consider to be a German enemy, and consequently the third of the prop is to strike a deal with the Allies, and particularly the United States, in order to send aid, relief, and food to Germany, and consequently to mitigate those conditions out of which real revolution might spring. And what you have here is something very fundamental, not only for Germany, but for the creation of a whole American strategy. Because the American strategy of containment, the American strategy of using food politically and using relief politically, really gets its trial run in Germany after the First World War. Now, the alternative, you see, of Germany's turning toward the Allies was to turn to the other defeated countries, especially the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union offered a deal to the Germans. And they did so because all the time that the Soviet leaders are preaching world revolution, they are also very conscious of having friends on the outside that will enable them to relieve the pressure on their frontiers. And consequently, even before the Republic is established, on the 3rd of November of 1918, the Soviet Foreign Office, effectively Chechen, offers to Max of Baden, the Chancellor, some wheat from Russia in order to help alleviate the food shortage. Now, this is incredible from the point of view that the Russians themselves are really starving. But the idea is to try to strike some kind of an alliance with defeated Germany and consequently to relieve that pressure on the western frontier of Russia. And that request for an alliance and the sending of wheat is answered the next day on the 4th of November by Max of Baden and his government, with Scheidemann in it approving, dismissing the Soviet ambassador Joffrey from Germany. And consequently it is turned down flat. Then comes the revolution and there is a republic. And presumably there are socialists in power. And once again, the Soviets renewed their request for some kind of an alliance. And on the 10th of November, there was actually a call from the Executive Council of the Workers' and Soldiers' Council, or Soviet, in Germany, demanding that a deal be struck with the Russians, that there be an alliance of socialists, and that is again turned down by the Council of People's Commissars. Now, the explanation should not be hard to find. The explanation, in the first place, is the fear on the part of the socialists who were running Germany at that time that the Russians were insincere, that they really only wanted a foothold to foment a Bolshevik revolution in Germany, and in fact they were not so inaccurate. Because on the 11th of November, the very next day after the request by the Executive Council of the German Soviet, on the very next day, the 11th of November, the Russian Foreign Minister or Foreign Commissar Chicherin sent back this message to those German councils of workers and soldiers: the Scheidemanns and the Erzbergers will sell you to capitalism. In the armistice, they will agree with the British and French capitalists that you surrender your arms. Soldiers and sailors of Germany, do not surrender your weapons. With these weapons, effective power must be seized, and a workers' and soldiers' and sailors' government, headed by Liebknecht, must be formed. Do not let yourself be talked into a national assembly, into a bourgeois republic. Well, but obviously, the Russians were mingling and meddling, and obviously trying to promote a more advanced revolution, and that was one reason that these moderates especially, who belonged to the SPD, would have nothing to do with a Russian deal. But it was even more profound than that. And that is that they had to turn their backs on the Russians. That was the quid pro quo of getting any kind of help from the West at all, and getting mitigated terms that would not be so harsh. In short, what they did was to turn to the Allies and say that we will keep order in Germany. We will not permit Bolshevism to advance in this country if you feed us, if you enable us at least to mitigate the conditions out of which a violent revolution may come. And effectively, you see, they were talking to the United States, because the United States was the only country that had the wherewithal to feed Germany at that time. All the other countries are plastic, and if you stop to think about it, and it really boggles the mind, that every time there is a crisis in the world, the only country that has the means is the United States. And consequently, it happened after the First World War, it happened after the Second World War, it happens at every turn. And so the United States, with all of this food, and with all of this money, and all of these resources, turned back toward Germany. Now, what the United States expected and wanted was spelled out in his usual mystifying manner by Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson is a great mystifier. And all during 1917, he is talking about a peace without annexations, without indemnities. He is talking about a peace to end all wars, and consequently deflecting all kinds of serious attention to the social structures of the countries, after all, that have made war and been belligerent. And now, on the 11th of November of 1918, when he sends to Congress a message that proclaims the armistice to end the First World War, he adds a message about the potentiality of aid. And you must understand that you have to cut through Wilson's rhetoric with a very sharp knife, because that rhetoric is thick, layer upon layer. And Wilson's message of 11 November reads this way: hunger does not breed reform. It breeds madness and all the ugly distempers. Now you see, for a man to talk about revolution as an ugly distemper really tells you something about Wilson. As though he were dealing with dogs. Hunger does not breed reform, it breeds madness and all the ugly distempers that make an ordered life impossible. The present and all that it holds belongs to the nations and the peoples who preserve their self-control and the orderly processes of their government. The peoples who have just come out from under the yoke of arbitrary government and who are now coming at last into their freedom will never find the treasures of liberty they are in search of if they look for them by the light of the revolutionary torch. We must hold our light steady until they find themselves. And in the meantime, there are some happy signs that they know and will choose the way of self-control and peaceful accommodation. And if they do, we shall put our aid at their disposal. Well, it took a bit of doing to find out what he meant, but the Germans, after all, do. And so Ebert, the very next day, the 12th of November, appealed to Lansing, the Secretary of State, and said, if we keep order, do we get help? And Lansing said yes. And consequently, the slogan went out in Germany, no disorder, no starvation. Disorder, no bread. And consequently, the idea of the Americans coming in with help became very fundamental. Now, Lenin quite well understood what was at stake, because he had the patience to cut through that rhetoric. And consequently, Lenin put it this way: with a simple weapon, the noose of famine, Wilson's agents are throttling revolution, playing the policeman, and issuing orders. And he was not so far wrong, because there wasn't anything terribly humanitarian about that food mission after the First World War. Now, the director of that food mission, who became the Allied Director General of Relief and of Aid, was Herbert Hoover. And Hoover was appointed to this position at the end of December of 1918, a Quaker with good humanitarian spirit and so forth, but he was extremely categorical. And he said to Wilson, right after the armistice, he said, look, now we have in the United States about 20 billion pounds of surplus for 1919 coming up, and we have, or 20 billion tons of surplus, and we have had only 6 million in the period before the First World War. In other words, we really can supply the world, but more than that, we have to supply it, because otherwise our commodity prices in agriculture will drop precipitously. And consequently, you've got a magnificent combination that you could stop Bolshevism both at home and abroad. In other words, that you could prevent their depression, you could prevent their collapse, and on the other hand, you could really feed people and consequently take them away from that kind of belly revolutionary politics that after all starvation induced. And so food began to be sent out in November, more in December. Congress passed a very large appropriation in the middle of January of 1919, and the argumentation all along the way has nothing hidden about it. It is point one, that we saved the world from Bolshevism. Point two, that we saved it for the capitalist market. Point three, that we supplied the world with our agricultural surplus. And fourth, that as a result of that humane mission, we get a favored place economically in the markets of the world. And consequently, it was on all fronts a very self-interested policy, a policy which the Germans accepted, out of their self-interest, which was to try to make those conditions of stability out of which they could nip any further revolution in the bud. And consequently, on the crux of these kinds of arrangements, the SPD perfectly well figured that it could contain a serious social revolution. What happened was that by the time you get to December of 1918, the government, in which the SPD is surely the strongest force because it has the most support in the working class still, a working class that really knew no other party but the SPD, that by the time December comes, you already have the contours of counter-revolution emanating from this revolutionary government, that it is really using force and violence at almost every turn to repress further advances of the revolution. Now that comes about through the constant appeal to the armed forces from the beginning of December, there are these telephone calls from Adolf Hitler in which he says send troops. Now, it was difficult to send troops because the army in Germany had fought for 4 years and consequently was exhausted and wanted to go home and didn't want to fight its brethren in street fighting, and consequently, out of that need for armed force, you begin to get the Freikorps developed in December of 1918, the Free Corps, which become really a very fundamental item in the entire snuffing out of the revolution. Because the Freikorps, or the Free Corps, these are kind of vigilante armed bands. They are organized by generals and officers. They're organized by regular army people, but they are mercenaries. They're volunteers. You get at the officer level men who very frequently are prescient in their formation or spirit, and who think that all hell is broken loose on the streets, that there is nothing but anarchy, and that you must repress that anarchy. And at the rank and file level, among those who join the Freikorps, you get adventurers, you get thugs, you get disenchanted and disillusioned men who can't find jobs, you get people who get some pay, and consequently are perfectly willing to bump up the streets. Now these Freikorps, these really vigilante bands, are in a sense sponsored by the government. Not officially, but they take an oath of allegiance from the 17th of December on to Adolf and the government, and the government very frequently praises them. At that time, on the 4th of January of 1919, when Adolf in Moscow, who was the Minister of War, who was called the Bloodhound, went out, these two socialists, and reviewed contingents of the Freikorps and told them that they were doing magnificent work for democracy, and consequently, you begin to get this tradition of vigilantes really contesting the working class on the street and really beginning to rule the street in a very ominous way. And so you have the pouring out of troops, the pouring out of Freikorps. On the 6th of December of 1918 occurs an incident, and it is that the offices of the Rotefana, which is the newspaper of the Spartacus, the newspaper in which Pete Nash and Rosa Luxemburg wrote, that the Rotefana is occupied and its presses are broken, and then you have the same group of Freikorps going into the offices of the Executive Committee of the Councils of Workers and Soldiers Soviets and trying to arrest the Executive Committee. Now there was obviously street action after this. And consequently, on the 7th and 8th of December, there are strikes on the street called by the left-wing independent socialists, called by the Spartakists, called by the revolutionary shop stewards, and Adolf gets a bit frantic. And so Hindenburg calls him on the 8th of December and says, hold back. The army is with you. Your function, after all, is to make sure that the streets are stable. From the 10th of December, Adolf really calls for large-scale reinforcements in the city of Berlin. All of which means that the government has the choice of either dissolving the council or trying in some way to live with them and decide to dissolve them. Now the councils were the only really original socialist thing that came out of the revolution in November. These are councils rather modeled on Russian Soviets, councils of workers, of soldiers, of sailors, and they are a thorn in the side of Adolf and his government. And consequently, on the 13th of December, Adolf says, we must suppress these councils, and what we want to do is to call a constituent assembly. In other words, to draw up a constitution for a liberal bourgeois Germany that will be democratic and republican and get rid of these damnable councils. Now, the independent socialists were the question. Were they going to permit the councils to be dissolved, or were they going to fight for them? In other words, would the revolution be a conciliar revolution or a Soviet revolution, or would it be a parliamentary revolution? And consequently, the Spartakists, who were a sector of these independent socialists, who had joined that party at Gotha in April of 1917, who were the left wing of that party, the Spartakists insisted that they fight for the council, and a great meeting was held on the 15th of December, which tells us a great deal about the destiny of this whole affair. Because on the 15th of December is held a meeting in Berlin of the USA Day, of the Independent Socialist Party. And a resolution is put there by Hilferding, the independent socialist, who said, we cannot expect a Soviet revolution now. We must dissolve the council, and we must call for a constituent assembly and a liberal democracy in Germany. To which Rosa Luxemburg put a contrary motion, and she said, we must dissolve this government. We must have a government of Soviets or councils, that the independent socialists must immediately stand for that, and that was put to a vote, and overwhelmingly, the independents voted for the Hilferding motion, which already meant that the revolutionaries were a small group of independents, plus the Spartacists of Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and it already raised the question of whether they shouldn't found a separate party, all of their own, a communist party, if you please, that might try to forward this revolution. For a moment, the independents stood fast, and they stood fast over an episode that happened on the 24th of December. And that is the last moment when a large party like the Independent Socialists might have tried to push the revolution. And that episode of the 24th of December is really a telling one. There had been a group of sailors in Berlin known as the People's Naval Division, an extremely interesting squadron. And they had occupied what was called the Marstall, which was the royal stable next to the palace. And consequently, in the Marstall, they had set themselves up near the center of Berlin as the watchdog of the revolution. And they had looked at the government and protested, gone to the streets incessantly, until the government couldn't stand it any longer. And consequently, the commandant of troops for the Berlin area, a man named Otto Wels, who was himself a social democrat, decided that he had to oust these sailors, the so-called People's Naval Division, from the royal stables. And so they got the order on the 23rd of December, get out of there. And they responded to that by surrounding General Headquarters and taking General Wels as a hostage. He remained inside the stables, whereupon Ebert and the Social Democrats, without even telling their comrades of the Independent Socialist Party in the government, decided on a frontal attack against this People's Naval Division, and consequently, the 24th of December, it was Christmas Eve of 1918, there is an attack by troops upon these sailors, some 70 are left dead. The next day, Christmas Day, there is a tremendous street response. And once again, the Spartacists, the revolutionary shop stewards, the working class gets out on the street and really protest. And the chief of police, who happens to be at that time a left-wing independent socialist named Eichhorn, will not call out the police, and consequently, momentarily, the streets are in the hands of the workers, and the government has to let the sailors stay in their particular place, but a deal is struck, Otto Wels is released from hostage, and the sailors say they will not participate too much in politics, they remain in their particular place. But the important thing is that the independent socialists, at that moment, saw how much counter-revolutionary potential there was in these SPD people, in Ebert and Scheidemann and people of that sort, and consequently resigned after 6 weeks, resigned from the Council of People's Commissars, and so you get an all-SPD government by the 26th of December of 1918. Now, in resigning, one might have thought that there would be then a real revolutionary union between the independent socialists and the Spartacists, but it was not to be. It was already too late, and the Spartacists decided that they had to go it themselves. On the 29th of December of 1918, the Spartacist League meets in Berlin, and overwhelmingly vote to form a new political party, a revolutionary political party. The KKK, it will be called the German Communist Party, and the founding Congress of that held between the 30th of December of 1918 and the 1st of January of 1919. And Rosa Luxemburg was not happy. Nor was Harvey. And they were worried about the founding of a new party. And Rosa was worried about the founding of this party at the end of December because she said, it is never good to cut yourself off from the socialist masses. It is never good to be pure but sectarian. It is never good to go away from the mainstream of reality, and consequently she thought it better to remain inside the constellation of the Independent Socialist Party. So did Wiesner, so did Jovic. They all thought, these old leaders, it was better to stay, but they were roundly outvoted on the 29th of December by the young Spartacus who had come in since the end of the war, who had been flooding into the Spartacus League, and who said, no, we will have nothing to do with those people, they are too unreliable. And when that was said, Rosa Luxemburg and Wiesner went along with it. The only dissenting vote, Leo Jovic, who to the very end said, it is a terrible mistake. And so you get the forming of a new revolutionary party, one that takes on to itself the mission of forwarding this revolution. And when the Spartacus turned into the German Communist Party, it really raises the question of what prospects that party had, what its potentialities were, what its weaknesses were. And remember this, that the Spartacus were always a sect during the First World War, that they never had very many members, they never had very many militants, that the best they could do was to try to push the independent socialists after they joined that party at Gotha in 1917. But that after the war, the Spartacus began to pick up a lot of membership. There are never more probably than several 100,000, which is small for a party, after all, that insisted it's going to make a revolution or takes upon itself that particular mission. But in a revolutionary situation, and this is Lenin's wisdom in Letters from Afar, in a revolutionary moment, when the masses, unemployed, really suffering inflation, really frustrated after demobilization, when that mass begins to become radicalized, numbers really don't make any difference. If you have really a cadre of several 100,000 that can entrain, that can really push, and that can catalyze this mass radicalism, then you have something very powerful indeed. From the point of view of numbers, I don't think it is the place in which you fault the founding of the German Communist Party. But there are two other questions that it seems to me are much more profound and that really go to the heart of the tragedy. One is the question of decentralization, the question of a lack of organization. And the strength of the Spartacus had been very much like the strength, for example, of what is called the movement in the United States, that it had been very localized, that there had been very little central command over it, and that what had happened was that it was possible to catalyze every local discontent and to move the mass at that local area. And consequently, even after you come to the end of the war and the founding of the German Communist Party, there is a reluctance to centralize. Now that is valuable if you have the philosophy of Rosa Luxemburg, that the mass means everything, that you have always to be responsive to the potentiality of people on the move. But it is a disaster, you see, if you are in a repressive period and you are facing a state which has a central kind of ideology and a central kind of apparatus and really wants to repress not only locally but nationally. And at that point, if you are to defend yourself and defend your apparatus, you have to have a hell of a lot more centralism than either the Spartacus or the early German Communist Party ever had. But what is at the heart of the problem is the problem of action. Now, the glory of Spartakism had been its unwillingness simply to theorize. It had been an activist kind of organization. and consequently have insisted upon confrontation, have insisted upon the greatest dimension of courage in the streets, direct action by the people who are concerned. But with all that, Spartakism in its origin had all kinds of people in the leadership, like Rosa Luxemburg and Yogachev and Titnev and Zetkin and Nering, who were brilliant theorists, and consequently who understood something about the conditions in which any action really took place, who could calculate and predict. What happens is that at the end of the war, the people who really fill the ranks of Spartakism are young demobilized soldiers. They are the young. They are the impatient. They are the frustrated and the embittered. They are people who are unemployed and consequently who don't have a sense of organization, who don't have a sense of theory and of distance, as it were, of calculating the consequences, but take from Spartakism simply the kernel of action itself, and consequently become activists to the point that Karl Radek, who after all was left-wing and was the Russian emissary in Germany, to the point that Radek said, these young Spartakists are impossible. They think that with a few firings of the gun, they will overthrow a whole system. And it is true that these young Spartakists were constantly in the street. They were responding to every sign, and sometimes inventing signs where none were there, and consequently moving always toward that action, And you see, Rosa was concerned about that. And she talked incessantly about the need for understanding, the need for ideology, the need for strategy, the need for organization. And she tells them, at the founding Congress of the German Communist Party, she tells them in no uncertain terms, government by the proletariat can only battle its way to complete clarity and readiness step by step through a long valley of sorrows, of bitter experience, of defeats and victories. The victory of Spartacus is not at the beginning, but at the end of the revolution. And when she spoke on the 30th of December and the 31st of December, and she said, look, we are in a moment now that is defensive, that fundamentally the independents are not with us, and certainly the SPD is not with us. And consequently, we have a long road to travel. And for the moment, we cannot have a Soviet revolution that has been defeated for the moment. So let us go to the elections. Let us go to these elections for the Constituent Assembly and make as much revolutionary propaganda as we can, elect as many of our own as we can. And when Rosa attacked Ebert or Scheidemann, and she could attack them magnificently, and she called them, after all kinds of things, and they should have cheered. But when she said go to the elections, they didn't cheer. And consequently, her resolution of going to the elections was outvoted 60 to 20 at this founding Congress, and Rosa said this to those who defeated her proposal. Comrades, you take your radicalism all so easily. With all our stormy impatience, we must not lose the necessary seriousness and need for reflection. The Russian example against the Constituent Assembly does not apply. When the Constituent Assembly was driven out there, our Russian comrades had a Trotsky-Lenin government. But we still have an Ebert-Scheidemann government. We need a forum for our revolutionary propaganda. But they voted that down. That impatience, that impetuosity, that willingness to make a revolution on the cheap, all of that was built into Spartakism and the early history of the German Communist Party at the turn of 1919. But once the party was founded, it was relative. And she rallied to it. And when Clara Zetkin said, well, he's young, after all, can we cope with them? They're on the streets all the time, and aren't they a little bit mad? And Rosa wrote back on the 4th of January, and she said, our defeat on the electoral issue was merely the triumph of a somewhat childish, half-baked, narrow-minded radicalism. But the Spartakists are a fresh generation, and they are free from the cretinous traditions of the good old party. We all decided not to take that issue too seriously and to try to train these wonderful young comrades. So she thought to train. But it all came very quickly. Because you know, Spartacism or communism, as it developed at the end of December of 1918, was the only really revolutionary threat in Germany. And not only the capitalists understood that, but the moderate socialists understood it also. And consequently, from December on, you begin to get this frenetic campaign against Spartacism, against communism, against the revolutionary shop stewards, against those few that are still standing for a revolution and are articulating it, and have the potentiality, because the conditions are there, for bringing the mass into the act. By December 25th, Rosa Luxemburg is writing to a friend and she is saying, I hear all kinds of rumors that I am to be assassinated. And it is literally true that if you look into the literature of that period, she is called a diabolical woman, Karl Liebknecht is called a murderer, and it is said that Germany must be done with them, must be rid of them. And you see what the danger is. Rosa Luxemburg recognized the danger. If there is precipitate action, will that not mean the signal for repression? The proletarian revolution, she said, will always have to reckon and fight with this particular enemy, our enemy from within, which is the tool of counter-revolution. And that's the way it happened in January of 1919. On the 5th of January of 1919 was an issue. The SPD government fired the chief of police of Berlin, who was a left-wing independent, who later became a communist, named Eichhorn. They fired him because they said he did not keep order on the streets, and they put in a right-wing socialist to replace him. And when that happened, both the independent socialists and the new Communist Party called for street demonstrations. And on the 5th and 6th of January, there were street demonstrations beyond anybody's imagination. The people really poured into the streets in Berlin, and indeed in other cities in Germany, in answer to that call. And at that moment, there suddenly was, in the Spartacist communist camp, there was, for that moment, the feeling that maybe the revolution had come. And consequently, on the 6th of January, there was a revolutionary council of 33 that was established among independent socialists, communists, and revolutionary shop stewards to direct these street actions. But by the 7th of January, it was perfectly obvious that it was not going to be a revolution. Because by the 7th of January, the councils themselves, the councils of workers and soldiers, repudiated this action, said they would not participate in it, and the government already was calling in troops, and here you have the problem. And Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht, who have committed themselves to this street action because they thought it was something on the 5th, how to turn back. Rosa Luxemburg said it many times that once you put the mass into action, you can't turn them back. And the independent socialists began to get out, and they began to bargain with the government and say they didn't mean it. And the revolutionary shop stewards were anonymous and they were not really exposed. But there were the communists, and Rosa and Karl Liebknecht suddenly having to make this decision. Now, Karl Radek is a Soviet agent, and he says there's no problem. You just desert the mass at this point. You tell them to go away, and if they get a bit clobbered, well, you can't help that, so you save the organization. You liquidate an error. But Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht could not do that, and they went with it. And from the 7th of January to the 15th, there is a constant effort on the part of communists in Berlin, especially, to try to make something out of street action that cannot be made. By the 12th of January, the troops are in Berlin, headed by Noske. They recover the office of Borger, which had been the SPD paper occupied by the masses. They recover that paper, and they begin repression. The 13th of January, they take over the offices of the German Communist Party and ransack it. And all the time, the hunt is on for Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And for weeks, they have lived from hotel to hotel and apartment to apartment. And they really were on the hunt and on the go. It was a question, really, of saving their lives and writing at the same time. By the time you get to the 14th of January of 1919, you have a very exhausted Rosa Luxemburg, a very exhausted Liebknecht and Jovichase. They are in constant hiding, in constant propaganda, because what they lack is an instrument for directing these masses. And Rosa is suddenly caught up with her own strategy. The idea is that the mass makes the revolution, but it has to be catalyzed, it has to be directed, and there is nobody out directing it. And she is being hunted, and so is Liebknecht. And on the 14th of January of 1919, in hiding, they write editorials for the Rosa Fama. And they are the last editorials that these two people wrote. And Rosa Luxemburg wrote an editorial on the 14th of January called Order Reigns in Berlin, because that was the phrase that Mosca used when he brought his troops in, and he said, now that I have ransacked these communist headquarters, order reigns in Berlin. And from her underground hiding, Rosa Luxemburg wrote in that editorial, order rules in Berlin, you stupid lackeys, your order is built on sand. Tomorrow the revolution will rear ahead once more and announce to your horror, amidst the brass of trumpets, I was, I am, I always will be the revolution. And Liebknecht, in an editorial in spite of all, wrote, whether or not we shall survive when all is achieved, our program will live. It will dominate the world of struggling peoples in spite of all, in spite of all. And those were their last writings. And they went to the apartment of a friend on the 15th of January in a middle-class district of Berlin. And they thought to hide in that respectability, but at 9 o'clock in the evening of the 15th of January, the Freikorps broke in on this apartment and found Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And all of the hatred and all of the hostility and all of the viciousness that comes out when you are confronted, after all, with an enemy that would change the structure of society, all of that comes out now. And so they find Liebknecht in Luxembourg, and they say, you are under arrest, and for Rosa that was old hat, and she said, okay, and she gathered up books, figuring again to be in prison. They are both taken down to the Hotel Eden, which is the center for that paramilitary organization of Freikorps in Berlin, and there they are interrogated by one Colonel Potts. And in the course of the interrogation, Rosa Luxemburg is, if anything, arrogant. And if anything, she answers back and defends her revolution, and consequently the two of them, both of them really fragile people, the two of them are then mercilessly clubbed. Clubbed into insensitivity and then dragged half dead out into the street. Each of them dragged into a separate automobile, each of them driven off to a separate place, Karl Liebknecht forced to leave that automobile at a certain lonely spot, staggered off a few feet and shot in the back 3 times. Rosa Luxemburg, not being able even to get out the door, shot in the head 4 times, and her body thrown into the Lambert Canal. And that body did not surface until the 31st of May, some 4.5 months later. The one who shot Rosa Luxemburg was a soldier named Junge. And the one who interrogated was a colonel named Potts. And the one who directed the entire operation was a lieutenant named Vogel. Colonel Potts still lived. Soldier Runge suffered 2 months in prison. And Lieutenant Vogel 4 months in prison for not reporting corpses. And consequently, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the leaders of German communism, assassinated on the 15th of January of 1919. For Jogachaise, it was incredible. Jogachaise had known Rosa Luxemburg for 30 years, and after that it made no difference. And consequently, he hardly tried to hide or disguise himself, picked up on the 10th of March of 1919 and shot in the police station and killed. And for old Franz Mary, who was aged and ailing at that particular time in a sanitarium, he heard it and was staggered, was catatonic for an entire week, and then dropped dead of heart failure. And consequently, the leadership of Spartacism wiped out in an event that has all importance, because that leadership, after all, was never there for German communism, because it indicated that with all of that love of the mass and belief in the mass, that there is something rather dangerous about the mass without the interaction of discipline and leadership, that it can be precipitate and with horrible results, and that it made a chasm between communism and socialism that was profoundly deep, because Nostra and Ebert and those men were in on the trigger, and that can never be wiped out of history.